In this episode, we're examining 5 of the dumbest animal encounters that ended in fatalities. From a man who stepped over barricades into crocodile-infested waters to a worker who accepted a dare to approach a bison. But first, we begin with a hiker's desire for the perfect photograph, leading him to make a decision that no amount of experience could justify. It was July 11, 2017, and the morning sun filtered through the lodgepole pines along the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail in Glacier National Park, casting long shadows across the path where Eldon Craik would take his final steps. Eldon was a 42-year-old regional ventilation technician from Spokane, Washington, a job that required meticulous attention to detail, but little imagination. He had decent weekend hiking experience in the Cascades, but had never ventured deep into true backcountry territory. This trip with his 15-year-old daughter, Maribel, was meant to be special. A last adventure before high school consumed her teenage years. Eldon had promised her wildlife and wilderness, something she could post about to make her friends jealous. They had set out early from the Iceberg Lake trailhead, detouring onto the less-traveled Ptarmigan approach. After Eldon decided the main trail looked too crowded, his goal was simple: photograph a bear from a safe distance. His bear spray remained clipped to his hip, the safety still in place, an inexperienced habit he had never practiced correcting. Grizzly bears in Glacier can weigh up to 800 pounds with shoulder muscles powerful enough to flip over boulders weighing several hundred pounds while digging for food. Mother grizzlies with cubs are particularly aggressive, responsible for the majority of fatal attacks in the northern Rockies. These facts were printed on pamphlets at every ranger station, but Eldon had waved them aside during check-in. Around 9:30 a.m., 3 separate groups of hikers descended past them, each mentioning the same thing: fresh grizzly scat on the trail ahead, still steaming in the cool morning air. One older couple specifically told Eldon they had turned back after spotting what looked like cub tracks diverging into thick brush. He made the decision then to follow the tracks off-trail. Maribel protested weakly, but Eldon was already pushing through mountain ash and serviceberry thickets. The vegetation grew denser with each step, closing around them until visibility dropped to less than 45 feet in any direction. The trail disappeared behind them. Eldon moved quickly, focused on the intermittent tracks. They emerged onto a narrow game trail that curved sharply around a massive Douglas fir. Eldon rounded the bend first, and suddenly there was no more time. Maribel said that about 35 feet ahead. A massive grizzly sow stood broadside, her 2 cubs visible just beyond her in a patch of huckleberries. The bear's head snapped towards them, her ears flattened against her skull. She released a harsh huff, her jaws popping once as her lips curled back. The SA surged forward, the bluff charge turning real, closing the distance in under 2 seconds. Eldon had time only to raise one arm before well over 400 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into him like a truck. The impact lifted him off his feet and drove him backward onto the packed dirt trail. His head struck an exposed rock, producing a sound Maribel would later describe to rangers as similar to a watermelon splitting. The SA reared slightly and brought her right paw down in a single devastating blow. Her 4-inch claws ran across Eldon's face and skull, while the force of the strike and the impact with the rock caused catastrophic fractures. The violent backward motion wrenched his neck, resulting in fatal cervical injury. Blood sprayed across the dirt and low vegetation. Eldon's body went instantly limp, but the bear wasn't finished. She lunged forward and clamped her jaws around his shoulder and upper chest. Her teeth designed to tear through tough hide and muscle, punching deep holes through his collarbone and into the soft tissue beneath. She twisted and mauled him briefly, then released him, pivoting back toward her cubs. The entire attack lasted less than 10 seconds. The 15-year-old Maribel, frozen in terror, roughly 15 feet behind, finally screamed and ran. She crashed back through the brush toward the main trail. She fought for a signal under the canopy and managed to place a call at 9:52 a.m., gasping out their approximate location between sobs. Another hiker intercepted her 3 minutes later and took over the call, providing more precise GPS coordinates from a handheld unit to dispatch. Rangers mobilized immediately, but had to approach by foot and ATV from the nearest access point. They reached the scene at approximately 10:30 a.m. Eldon Krowick was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. after Rangers secured the scene and confirmed the absence of vital signs. The medical examiner's preliminary report noted massive cranial trauma with skull fractures, fatal cervical spine injury, and deep puncture wounds to the right shoulder and chest cavity consistent with large predator dentition. The Ptarmigan Tunnel approach remained closed for 48 hours while Rangers monitored the area. The SA and her cubs were not pursued or euthanized. Officials determined she had acted in defense of her young. Marble, meanwhile, struggled in the months after the attack. She received counseling provided through the school district and local survivor support programs. As Rangers closed the Montana Trail, where a father's trophy photo would never be captured, in Australia, a man would step over warning barriers and wave off frantic shouts seconds before a 15-foot saltwater crocodile surged from the murky water. It was April 17, 2016. Like a wet blanket, the East Alligator River running brown and swollen from 3 days of monsoonal rain. Ronan Bolelwick stood at the edge of Cahill's Crossing, his boots caked in red mud, about to rinse his legs in water infested with ancient predators. Ronan was a 34-year-old diesel mechanic from Darwin, known at his workshop for two things: an ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone and a stubborn refusal to follow safety protocols. His co-workers had stories. Ronan working under unsecured lifts, bypassing lockout procedures, dismissing manufacturer warnings as corporate overcaution. He'd driven to Kakadu that morning alone after the wet season rains had finally broken, wanting to see the floodwaters before they receded. His ex-girlfriend later told investigators that Ronan had always treated warning signs as suggestions for other people. He'd been fined twice for entering restricted areas at national parks and had posted photos on social media standing on the wrong side of safety barriers with captions mocking the warnings. That afternoon's trip was meant to be quick. A few photos of the swollen crossing, maybe wade in the shallows to cool off, then back to Darwin before dark. Multiple signs lined the approach to the crossing. Crocodiles present in bold red letters. Danger. Do not enter water. A waist-high metal barricade had been installed specifically to keep visitors back from the water's edge. Ronan had stepped over it without hesitation, ignoring the stares of other tourists. One family, positioned on the elevated viewing platform with cameras, had watched him cross the barrier. The father called out a warning. Ronan waved it off with an irritated gesture and kept walking toward the water. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with males regularly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,000 pounds. Their bite force measures approximately 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any animal ever tested. They are ambush predators that exploit opportunity and territory and have been responsible for fatal attacks on humans who enter their habitat. Ronan reached the muddy bank where the road disappeared into the river. The water was murky, visibility zero, moving with deceptive calm despite the strong current underneath. Ronan bent down and began washing mud from his boots and lower legs, his back to the river. He was standing in shallow water, the water soaking through his jeans. The crocodile came from deeper water with almost no warning. A 15-oot male, territorial and aggressive during the wet season, had been stationary in the current for several minutes, blending with the surface glare and debris. It surged forward in a burst of speed that left barely a ripple on the surface. Witnesses saw the first impact knock Ronan sideways, the massive jaws clamping around his upper thigh. The femur failed under the pressure, tearing muscle and fabric as Ronan was pulled off balance. Ronan's scream was cut short as the crocodile's momentum dragged him off his feet. He struck the water surface once with his upper body, arms flailing before the animal rolled powerfully, using its body weight to destabilize and subdue him. The rotation was violent and controlled, the crocodile's body twisting with crushing force. Ronan's lower body disappeared beneath the churning brown water. Blood surfaced immediately, spreading rapidly in the current. The crocodile rolled again, forcing Ronan fully underwater. Witnesses on the viewing platform started screaming. Ronan's torso briefly resurfaced, his lower body no longer visible before he was dragged under again by the force of the river and the animal. Within seconds, Ronan disappeared completely. The crocodile submerged with its prey, leaving only disturbed water and an expanding blood slick. The entire attack, from initial strike to final submersion, lasted less than 30 seconds. Park staff were radioed immediately by witnesses. Rangers arrived 22 minutes later with search boats and firearms. They recovered Ronan's torso 6 hours later, caught in submerged tree roots along the eastern bank. His lower body was never found. The crocodile, believed to be the animal involved based on size, location, and timing, was not destroyed. Rangers noted it had remained in its territory and responded only when prey entered the water. The coroner ruled death effectively instantaneous due to massive traumatic injury and rapid exsanguination. The femoral artery had been severed in the initial bite, causing fatal blood loss within seconds. The official report noted multiple warning signs present at the location and that the victim had deliberately crossed a safety barrier. Ronan's family held a small memorial in Darwin. Authorities conducted a full review of visitor safety procedures at Cahill's Crossing, installing a new 5-foot metal barricade extending farther along the bank. Ranger patrols were increased during the wet season, and signage was updated with clearer warnings in multiple languages and graphics illustrating crocodile danger. Officials also distributed educational pamphlets highlighting the importance of obeying barriers, reinforced through social media campaigns and visitor briefings at entry points. Yet, even as a stubborn victim was torn apart by a crocodile thousands of miles away along Uganda's Kazinga Channel, a man was stepping into tall grass at dusk, where a 3-tonnen herbivore grazing in the reeds would prove deadlier than any fanged predator. It was June 23, 2017. The sun dropping toward the horizon over Uganda's Queen Elizabeth National Park, casting orange light across the Kazinga Channel, where Mathiasi Lorne had his camera raised toward a herd of elephants across the river, completely unaware that a 3-tonnen killer was grazing in the tall grass directly behind him. Mathiasi was a 39-year-old logistics consultant from Brussels, specializing in supply chain optimization for pharmaceutical companies. His wife Elise had planned this safari for their 10th anniversary, their first trip to Africa, 3 weeks touring Kenya and Uganda. Friends later told investigators that Mattis had a habit of wandering off during group tours, insisting he could get better photographs away from the crowd. He'd done it at the Masai Mara, at Lake Nuru, and now here along the Kazinga Channel. The itinerary that afternoon called for a sunset boat tour, followed by a brief walking safari along the southern bank. Mathiasi had grown restless during the boat portion, complaining that the mandatory life jackets ruined his photos. When the group disembarked for the walking portion, he'd immediately drifted away from the Rers's designated path, Elise following reluctantly, asking him twice to stay closer to the group. The ranger, a Ugandan national named Joseph Okello, with 12 years of experience, had warned the group 3 separate times before disembarking. Stay together. Stay on the cleared path. Do not approach the tall grass. Hippos graze there at sunset. He'd repeated the warnings in English and French for the European tourists. Park regulations required walking safaris to stay within marked routes, specifically because hippo movements at dusk were unpredictable and often invisible until too late. Joseph had noticed Mathiasi and Elise drifting away and called after them, but Mattis had only raised his hand in acknowledgement without stopping. Hippos kill more people in Africa than any other large animal, responsible for an estimated 500 deaths annually. Their massive jaws open to nearly 180 degrees, revealing canine teeth up to 20 in long, capable of biting a crocodile in half. Most critically, hippos are highly territorial and aggressive during dusk hours when they leave the water to graze, becoming especially dangerous when humans inadvertently position themselves between the animal and its retreat to water. The grass along the bank stood nearly 6 feet tall, dried and golden in the evening light. Visibility beyond 10 feet was essentially zero. Matthesy positioned himself for his shot, kneeling briefly to get the angle right. Elise stood behind him, glancing nervously at the thick grass to their right. She later told investigators she'd heard something, a rustling or heavy breathing, but Matthesy was focused on his camera's viewfinder. The main group was approximately 40 yards away, still visible, but too far for casual conversation. The hippo came through the grass with shocking speed. There was no roar, no warning vocalization beyond that, just the sudden explosive sound of vegetation being crushed and a massive gray form lunging forward. The animal was a full-grown male, likely weighing close to 3,500 pounds, that had been grazing less than 10 feet from where Matthesy knelt. Hippos have poor eyesight, but excellent hearing. Matthesy's movements and voice had likely been perceived as a territorial challenge or a threat to the animal's retreat path to water. Matthesy barely had time to turn before the hippo was on him. The massive jaws opened wide and clamped down across his pelvis and lower abdomen. The bite crushed Matthesy's hip bones immediately, the hippo's canine teeth punching through the pelvis and into the abdominal cavity. A catastrophic rupture of the lower torso exposed internal organs. The hippo heaved and twisted its massive head, wrenching at the body, tearing through tissue and muscle. Blood poured from the massive wound, soaking through his khaki pants and shirt. The hippo dropped the body. Matthesy collapsed in a heap, his lower half destroyed, blood spreading rapidly across the dry grass. He made no further sound. The hippo, having neutralized the perceived threat, turned and crashed back through the grass toward the water. The entire attack lasted less than 15 seconds. Elise had fallen backward when the hippo first charged, landing hard on the ground. She was screaming, a sound the other tourists heard clearly across the 40 yards of open ground. Joseph and 2 other rangers reached Elise within 30 seconds. They found her on the ground, still screaming, unable to look away from her husband's body. The rangers judged it too dangerous and the injuries unsurvivable. The priority was securing Elise and preventing a second incident. Park medical staff arrived 12 minutes later and confirmed death at the scene due to massive traumatic injury and catastrophic blood loss. The coroner's report filed with Ugandan authorities listed cause of death as severe crushing trauma to the pelvis and abdomen with complete destruction of internal organs, resulting in immediate shock and rapid exsanguination. Authorities handled the quiet repatriation of Matthesy's remains 2 days later. Elise returned to Brussels in a state of severe psychological trauma, requiring extended psychiatric care. However, even as Matthesy stubbornly wandered too close to the grazing grounds of one of Africa's deadliest predators in Alaska, a dock worker made a far more deliberate mistake, shouting and hurling rocks at an 800-pound brown bear feeding in a salmon stream. It was August 27, 2015, and the afternoon light slanted low across Kodiak Island's interior. The salmon run was peaking, and the scent of spawning fish hung thick in the air, a signal that drew both men and predators to the cold. Brent Ovik was a 51-year-old seasonal dock worker who had spent 7 summers on Kodiak, loading fishing boats and working cannery shifts during peak months. Colleagues said that he was competent but had a habit of priding himself on common sense over regulation. Brent had fished the streams in Kodiak Island dozens of times, often alone, and had encountered bears before without incident. That track record had calcified into a dangerous confidence. He had driven out that morning with a friend, Philip, another seasonal worker with far less experience on the island. They had hiked nearly 2 miles from the nearest logging road, pushing through wet brush and crossing shallow channels. Brent carried a well-used fly rod and a belt-mounted canister of bear spray in a holster within seconds' reach that he had purchased 3 seasons earlier and never once deployed. Kodiak bears are the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, with adult males regularly exceeding 1,000 pounds and standing over 9 feet tall on their hind legs. Their claws, adapted for digging and gripping salmon, can reach 4 inches in length. They are capable of running at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour over short distances, faster than any human can react. During the salmon run, their metabolism demands up to 90 pounds of fish per day, and they become intensely territorial over productive feeding sites. Around 2:30 that afternoon, Brent and Philip rounded a bend and spotted a massive boar feeding in the shallows, roughly 60 yards upstream. The bear was focused on the water, pinning salmon against the stones with practice efficiency. Philip suggested they back away quietly and try a different section. Brent disagreed. He had been planning to fish this exact stretch all week, and he believed the bear could be pushed off with enough noise and aggression. He began shouting, waving his arms, and then bent to gather stones from the stream bed. The first rock splashed near the bear. The second struck its shoulder. The bear lifted its head, water streaming from its muzzle, ears flattening, and a low huff escaping its throat, and locked eyes with Brent. Philip saw the shift immediately and started backing away, urging Brent to do the same. Brent threw a third stone. The bear exploded into motion, covering the distance in a focused, terrifying charge. 40 yards collapsed in seconds. Brent finally registered the danger and tried to step backward, his hand dropping towards the bear spray, still clipped to his belt. He fumbled with the holster, but his boot caught on a submerged stone, slick with algae, and his legs went out from under him. The bear hit him at full speed, driving Brent's torso into the rocky stream bed. Brent's head snapped backward violently on impact, his neck hyperextending past any angle the human spine was designed to tolerate. The vertebrae compressed and the ligaments tore. He made a wet, choking sound. The bear didn't pause. It reared slightly and brought its right paw down across Brent's head with a blow that cracked audibly even over the rushing water. The claws ran across his skull, splitting the scalp and exposing bone. Brent's body convulsed once, a reflexive response rather than conscious movement. The bear struck again, this time with its jaws, clamping down on the crown of his head and shaking with the same motion it used to kill salmon. The skull fractured under the pressure. Bone fragments driven inward. Blood poured into the stream bed, mixing with the clear water in spreading clouds of red. A third strike came, another paw across the face, and then the bear stepped back. It stood over Brent's motionless body for perhaps 5 seconds, breathing heavily, then returned to its salmon, ignoring Brent entirely, demonstrating a territorial, not predatory response. The entire attack had lasted less than 15 seconds. Philip broke and ran. He sprinted through the brush, stumbling and falling twice until he reached a slight rise where his phone showed a single bar of signal. He called 911. Alaska State Troopers arrived by boat and accompanied by a local wildlife officer. They found Brent face down in 6 inches of water, his head and neck injuries immediately apparent. The bear spray canister was still clipped to his belt, unused and undamaged. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as massive cranial trauma with secondary cervical spine dislocation. Skull fractures were present across the frontal, parietal, and occipital bones with severe brain tissue damage. Time of death was estimated at between 2:35 and 2:40 p.m. Alaskan wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and determined the bear had responded to a perceived threat in a manner consistent with normal territorial behavior during salmon season. Biologists canvassed the run, documented tracks and scat, and concluded the bear's behavior was defensive. No removal was authorized. Brent's body was flown to Anchorage the following day. Brent's case was closed after a fatal display of bravado in front of an apex predator. Meanwhile, in Yellowstone, a young warehouse worker would accept a weekend dare to test how close he could get to a grazing bison. It was June 23, 2018, a Saturday afternoon at Yellowstone National Park's Lamar Valley, where the Wyoming sun beat down on meadows dotted with herds of American bison. Within hours, the valley's deceptive tranquility would be shattered by the kind of preventable tragedy that park rangers had warned about for decades. Caleb Rensau, a 27-year-old forklift operator from Idaho Falls, would become another statistic in Yellowstone's grim ledger of visitor deaths. Caleb worked at a distribution warehouse operating heavy machinery in 10-hour shifts, 5 days a week. His co-workers described him as the guy who would take any bet, no matter how stupid, jumping off the loading dock into snow piles, racing forklifts after hours, once even touching a hot exhaust pipe because someone said he wouldn't. This weekend trip to Yellowstone was meant to be a break from routine, a chance to blow off steam with 3 friends from high school who still lived in the area. The group had arrived at the park early that morning, driving through the northern entrance with a cooler full of beer and vague plans to see wildlife. They had already passed several bison near the road, stopping multiple times for photos. By noon, they had parked at a pullout near Lamar Valley, where a large male bison grazed alone in a meadow roughly 80 yards from the wooden boardwalk where other tourists gathered. American bison are North America's largest land mammals, with males weighing up to 2,000 pounds and standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Despite their seemingly docile appearance, they are responsible for more injuries at Yellowstone than any other animal, including bears. Their skulls are reinforced with extra bone to withstand the impact of rutting battles, and their horns can gore with lethal precision. Park guidelines explicitly require visitors to stay at least 25 yards away from bison at all times. One of Caleb's friends watching the lone bison through the telephoto lens of his camera remarked that the animal looked calm. Another suggested they get a closer shot. Someone mentioned the 25-yard rule, but Caleb dismissed it, saying he had been closer to bison before, without incident. The animal had stopped grazing and was standing rigid, head slightly lowered. As Caleb began walking across the meadow, other visitors on the boardwalk immediately recognized the danger. Several people shouted warnings. A park ranger who had just arrived in his vehicle at the far end of the parking area began moving quickly toward the scene while radioing for backup. Caleb's friends called out for him to come back, but he waved them off, laughing. He continued forward, phone raised to record a selfie video, closing the distance to roughly 15 feet from the massive animal. And then the animal lowered its massive head and charged. The sound was described by witnesses as like thunder, hooves pounding the dry earth in rapid succession. Caleb had perhaps 1 second to register what was happening before the bison's skull, backed by nearly a ton of muscle and bone, struck him at full speed directly in the torso. The impact knocked Caleb to the ground, his body rolling roughly 3 feet before coming to rest on his back. Witnesses said that Caleb let out a startled gasp as he hit the ground before going still. The bison did not continue stomping. Instead, it used its head and shoulders to shove Caleb, nudging and tossing him slightly while keeping him pinned under its chest weight. Each movement bore down with hundreds of pounds of force, enough to crush ribs and severely compromise his thoracic cavity. Witnesses could see Caleb struggling under the immense pressure. The bison then gently pivoted away, lifting its head and trotting roughly 30 yards to a nearby rise where it resumed its rigid alert posture. Caleb lay crumpled in the grass, his chest collapsed at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from his nose and mouth. His eyes were half open but unseeing. One of his friends later told investigators that Caleb never moved significantly or spoke after hitting the ground. The park ranger who had been approaching reached Caleb within 2 minutes of the attack and immediately called for emergency medical response. He did not attempt CPR, recognizing that the massive trauma to the chest made resuscitation impossible. Park medics arrived 7 minutes after the initial call, but Caleb was pronounced dead at the scene. The preliminary assessment noted catastrophic thoracic trauma with the chest cavity completely compromised, multiple rib fractures with bone fragments driven into both lungs and the heart, and massive internal hemorrhaging. The incident received brief coverage in regional news outlets, with park officials using it to reiterate safety guidelines about wildlife distance. Caleb's 3 friends were interviewed by park law enforcement, but faced no charges as they had not physically participated in his decision to approach the animal. His family later released a statement asking visitors to respect park rules, though they struggled to reconcile how a moment of bravado had ended in such brutal finality. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.